Hello and welcome to Sound and Image Lab, the Dolby Institute podcast. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I am your host, Glenn Kaiser. Well, if you're like me, you have been mesmerized by the Netflix show The Crown. It's Emmy season once again, and The Crown has been nominated for an incredible 24 different Emmys this year, including one for Best Drama Series. I'm really thrilled to be able to focus our conversation today on The Crown, and specifically on an episode from season 4, the third episode of the season, called Fairytale. This is, for those of you who haven't seen it, this is the episode that follows the romance, the courtship, and the eventual marriage of Prince Charles with Lady Diana Spencer. And in addition to other nominations, this particular episode is nominated for Best Picture Editing and Best Sound Mixing, and I am super excited to have on the show today the two artists who got those nominations, picture editor Jan Miles and supervising sound editor and re-recording mixer Lee Walpole. So this episode is it's a masterclass in nonverbal storytelling and the use of subtext. Lots of really great stuff. So if you haven't watched it, I really encourage you to do so. And then you'll be more informed for this really fun episode where we really dive into this episode and talk with these amazing artists about how they pulled this off and made this really just an amazing episode of The Crown. It was my pleasure to sit down with Jan and Lee to talk about the work on the entire series, but on this episode in particular. So let's hear what they have to say. Lee and Jan, thank you for joining us today on the Dolby Institute podcast, and congratulations on your Emmy nominations for this episode of The Crown, Fairytale, episode 3, season 4. It's quite it's a really amazing episode. And you guys have been with the show. Lee, I believe you worked on all 4 seasons, all the episodes, and Jan, you've cut in at least one episode in each season. Is that right?
Pretty much. Even yeah.
So
yeah, we've been in it from the beginning. Actually, yeah, we've been on quite a journey.
I think one of the things that really struck me about this episode is how much nonverbal information is coming to the audience, and there's a couple sequences that I want to talk about. But I want to ask you both about. I'm always curious about the decisions around how to start the story and how an episode or a film opens. And in this one, there's such obviously the episode begins with this wonderful montage of everyone, sitting around by the phone waiting for Prince Charles to call with the news that he has proposed to Lady Diana Spencer. And it's such a remarkable montage. One of the things I love about it is that from an acoustic standpoint, everything starts so small and delicate. For the first minute or two of this episode, really all we're hearing is air and some birds and, the ubiquitous clock ticking. That seems to be a recurring acoustic element of this episode of The Crown. So I wanted to ask you both sort of those decisions around the formalism, both of the editing and the sound and the stillness and the quiet of it. How does that sort of reinforce and give us a sense of the power of the royal family? I'm fascinated by how you're communicating to us using picture editing and sound to give us that sense of who these people are.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that for most of us mortals, we don't sort of live in these sort of big spaces and stuff, in these sort of huge rooms, and I think it's a sort of challenge to sort of how what sort of one conveys in that space, and it's in that sort of montage. It was very clear from the very beginning, the idea was that, the clocks would sort of, the clocks are the sort of ticking bomb, and that sort of takes us from sort of room to room, until the phone call happens. It's these little ideas that sort of wed it together. And it was really interesting. You sort of really analyze the scene, and the scene is completely out of order. It sort of happened, the scene happened ages ago with Diana and the telephone call, it's sort of, we play around with time and space, which I think is sort of again, it's a very Crown thing to do, and on the call, people answer different people's questions. It felt, I mean, it actually felt what, I think we sort of opened on a wide shot of Windsor Castle, and that felt completely traditional. It's sort of like, that's not a very Crown thing. Normally you sort of find yourself in the middle of a story. So it felt, we sort of go, we were sort of leading you in, the audience in, sort of go, this is a fairy tale, and here's the castle, and here's the little car, and here's the little princess, the small things. I mean, there's a little bit of detail, by the telephone, and this is the sort of thing that Ben does, that we know later in the dialogue that there's a conversation about, where was it? It's in the nursery, like the nursery, but by the telephone, he's got a small soldier figure in his hand. And it's these little sort of, this again is that kind of detail that Ben does, the sort of macro thing. And he sort of pushes his finger at as he's on the phone. And it's those little things that we come up with in the edit that sort of, maybe people know, maybe people don't, but this sort of soldier represents duty. So when you get to the end of the episode and you get to the monologue with Mother, and she's basically saying it's your duty to go through with this, that's our idea, that he's picked this little soldier up from the very first scene of the film, so it's sort of seeded in. Notice it at your, at your peril, but it's those kind of little things. I find that, you can have this big room, but you can have this small soldier. In the same way, you can have this big sound, but you can have this small sound inside those spaces as well. And the clocks did that really well. We talked about the clocks, didn't we, Lee?
Absolutely.
About being the rhythm, like the sort of like, as the film went on, we would adjust the tempos of the rooms slightly more. So the more Diana became embellished into this family, the faster the clocks got. But Lee will probably tell you more about that. But
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it'll be the same clock within a space, but we'll time compress it so the ticking starts to speed up. So you just get an increased momentum and tension. Just really subtle stuff. But
yeah, it was kind of, we talked about this, Lee, didn't we? In those sort of scenes with Diana, when she's waiting. I know we're jumping forward from the first scene, but the scenes where she sort of waits in rooms, and it was a sort of conversation we had. Sort of, how do you do waiting? How do you do time passing? How do you do silence? Sort of, it's like that question: how do you shoot a film in the dark? And have it dark. It was sort of those questions sort of came to us, and we sort of answered them. And I found again with that edit, I could cut her from the bed, a hard cut her to the window, and then Lee would do something sort of small. It'd be like the bare foot on the creaky floor to the window netting. And they're really simple things. But when you're watching it, you just feel like you sat in there for hours like she has, which is kind of, this, in that simplicity, it works. Don't tell me how it works and why it works, but it does work. But, it's...
I was going to say, cutting through time in empty rooms and quiet rooms is a challenge in itself. So that has, different traffic things. A bus takes your ear on one cut, it's a plane on the next cut. There's a bird somewhere else. And as Jan says, footsteps, small micro movements. But yeah, just trying to, and it does play. And they're quite subtle atmospherically as a piece, The Crown, but I'd say deceptively so. There's actually a lot going on. It's just all very held back, and we're always very aware on the show that we are a dialogue-led show, and we don't want to distract from the dialogue at any given moment. But when the atmospheres are allowed to step forward,
I think you got a lot of opportunity to play with those atmospheres on this, and I'm glad that you brought up that the work about establishing time passing for Diana. Our friends at Netflix have been gracious enough to give us a few clips to discuss. And one of the ones that I thought of when you were just talking about that is this. We have a clip of, I think this is Diana early on. She's been moved into Buckingham Palace to be there to avoid the paparazzi and also to kind of be trained in the royal etiquette. So this is a really wonderful sequence of her waking up in her apartment in Buckingham Palace and sort of waiting for something to happen. And then they start to bring her mail to her and her letters. So let's take a listen to this clip.
morning.
Good morning, Mum.
What's all this?
It's your post, Mum.
Right.
Dear Lady Diana, I don't suppose you'll ever get to read this, but I wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed seeing the interview you gave with the Prince of Wales on television the other day. You looked then that it really must be love. To see a young couple at the start
Already has a poster of you and Prince Charles on her bedroom wall.
Listening to this special day on the radio with my mother, I have sent you a traditional marriage blanket.
It's because you love people no matter where they're from.
That you were someone I could talk to.
Your hairstyle and how you have a smile for everyone.
Can I be your flower?
It's also romantic.
Because I have never been one and my sister has. Freed young, age 7.
I'm curious about the sound of Buckingham Palace. How did you, Lee, kind of build the palette of sounds? And it's obviously, it's a lot of air, but there's also a lot of subtle sound design work going on as well.
Yes, it's quite rich and deep and warm. As you say, it's extremely subtle stuff, but there's always beds of various traffics running because we are in central London. We never want people to forget that. And it's important to bring a set to life, isn't it? To create the world outside, to make the illusion complete. So, I mean, whether anyone would ever notice, but yeah, you know, season 1 was absolutely sort of period traffic. So you'd get those kind of the vintage cars pottering past, and all very, very distanced because, you know, the palace is so set back. And then as we've gone through the years, you know, we've arrived at the 80s now. So all of those kind of beds have had to evolve and move with time. And then we use sort of route master buses are a great punctuation element.
It's always like those rooms. It's like, this is my best way to sort of understand it. It's like, and I don't know if you sort of experience this. It's like when you go somewhere opulent, like a sort of really sort of expensive hotel, you know, and you sort of get in the foyer, there's that sort of something, you know, they sort of pump in that air, don't they? It's sort of slightly, there's something that makes you sort of feel the opulence. There's, you know, you're allowed into it. You know, for me, it's sort of, it's that experience. It's like when you go into those rooms, you can sort of cut the air, you know, it's thicker, like Lee's saying, it's warmer. It's like, and that's, you know, I think what comes off on camera when they're sets is not that. You know, I think what you know, Lee and the guys do, and we try and achieve in that, is to sort of have that same sensation. And it is, for me, it's like the air, it's like the atmosphere in the room is thicker in these places. These sort of people, something to do with these people and that opulence allows that.
And then we've got so many layers of the stuff going on as well, Glenn, because you're cutting from room to room in the palace and you want each of those spaces to feel different. So, of course, you know, each time as you're mixing the scene, you're kind of playing with your settings there, you know, getting more low end, more taking some air out and trying different things there. But, you know, I guess we're kind of playing with sort of 40 different beds of traffic, you know, that we're kind of, you know, using a couple each time in each scene and cutting back and forth between them. And then another sort of real feature of the palace, I suppose, is trying to give it that sense of scale. So obviously doors are a big, bassy sub, you know, full of character, echoing around the room. And footsteps are a massive thing for us in this show. So we record live feet for every episode. So the feet have been recorded on various locations. Some of it's the shooting locations used in this show. Some of it's just various manor houses that we've had access to over the last few years. And we've built up a huge library of walks, which we've recorded, you know, natural walk-ins, walkaways, tracking walks. So you can just, you know, fit it footstep by footstep. And so every foot in the show is actually cut in for the interiors anyway. I mean, exteriors, we largely lean on Foley, traditional Foley. But yeah, the interiors are all hand cut by one of the sound editors. And that's not a single footstep. You know, that can be five layers deep of getting the right carpet, the right kind of floorboard underneath, the right creak, and you want a bass sweetener. Oh, and we want to make sure it's a leather sole. So you kind of just add these various ingredients and blend it until you've got the right thing. But it's a beautiful thing in this show because when someone's approaching a room, you can hear it for sort of 15 seconds as they slowly come up a corridor and, come into the room. And we do that in the show very much. And Jan gives us those shots that are held long enough for it all to happen. So you can get a sense of Charteris approaching for, a whole conversation. Then he suddenly arrives and you just heard him slowly tickling up to you.
I'm glad you point that out, because it takes, it takes the picture editor giving you the room and the space to kind of tell that part of the story acoustically without just cutting from dialogue to dialogue to dialogue, and taking all the air out of it. So I know you guys have worked together, obviously on this show, but also on some others. Can you talk a little bit about your working relationship? I mean, Lee, are you feeding any sound effects to Jan while he's cutting picture, or is Jan, are you doing your own kind of sound effects work while you're cutting, and then you guys have a little bit of tug of war when you get on the mixing stage, or how do you navigate that together?
Jan always sort of sets up. He knows what he wants it to be very much. So there's always a very good skeleton or foundation in the Avid. If he's really struggling, he'll give me a buzz and ask for some sounds, but he's got a library he's using as well. But I'd say, Jan's got a lot of thoughts about sound, and you get it from the cutting copy. It's not one of those things where you kind of get something served up and it's like, figure out how you're going to make this work. The approach that I have is sort of, the pictures and sound go together. It's like it's the fusion of those things. So I have to believe the scene and sell the scene to myself first before, screening it to others. And sound becomes part of that. And it's really interesting, because when I go in with, and I take it to that place and we talk about it, and then Lee and the guys come on board and they sort of take it up to this, this other level. And it's really fascinating. So sometimes, that you're in that room and surrounded by these sort of speakers, and it sort of all of a sudden become alive. And there's something in it sometimes, occasionally, like I'll be like, it's not, because sound can change an edit, it can change everything. It can change the intonation, it can change the nuance, all those things, and you hold on to that. And sometimes you can't, it's not like you give a note because you give it because you know what it is. You don't really know what it is to give the note. You sort of just, so when it's like that, I go to Lee, can I just go back to what I did? Can you just play me, the temp track from the Avid? And he's like, he sort of looks at me, presses play, and it's this tiny little track that I sort of, in my world before, sounded amazing. And now you're in this Lee's space in this room, and he plays it, and it just, I go, I'll forget that. It was awful. It's like, you think you remember, but this evolution of this sound is sort of taken on this whole new world. But you want to be reminded of where it came from. And therefore the two things go together. But it goes from, a 2 to an 11, we did the scene when Diana leaves the house and she's, for the first time, she leaves the girlfriends, and she's confronted and that door opens up and the paparazzi there and the secret, the secret police guys or whatever they are, to protect her, MI5 or something, and the crowd and the perhaps it's her sort of first experience of that. And it was interesting. We were sort of working on that sound. We had it sort of in the Avid to a point, but we did some picture changes there, didn't we, Lee? There was some we did a picture change and then we did a sound change. And I sort of came up with this, why don't we take the sound around the back of the car and lose the stuff on the inside? And sort of we went down that road, and about 2 days later, the sort of email popped up from Lee and sort of going, I think we've lost all that magic. What did we do? What were we thinking? And I was like, I agree. And you sort of go 2 days back and press that. I mean, it's not just pressing that button, but you go back to what sort of like my instinct where it started and Lee's instinct, what he did. And somehow we messed with it, but somehow, luckily, we're semi-smart enough to go, let's undo all that and go back to how it was because it was much better, and that's kind of our relationship, I guess,
I feel like the paparazzi get acoustically, they get bigger and bigger every time we see them, and they're more intrusive. Lee, can you talk about that? Must have been a challenge for you to kind of build and shape the presence of the paparazzi and to communicate kind of what effect that had on Diana.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that, of course, we were very aware of, and making them feel threatening and aggressive. So it's a combination of effects tracks that are giving us a real kind of energy of aggression, of the shouts, and then specific loop groupage shot that's giving you the actual questions that are relevant to any given moment, and then always a barrage of cameras. But they're not all the same, those scenes as well. For instance, then you go to the airport when Diana's saying goodbye to Charles and he's leaving, and that's a scene in the rain. I don't know if you remember that sequence. And the scene ended up being entirely ADR because they were shooting in so much rain anyway. But Jan and Ben were both desperately keen to hold on to the intimacy of the moment. And what that allowed us to do, having the ADR, it gave us real freedom there. So I guess we were grabbing onto the fact that at this point in the relationship between Charles and Diana, nothing's gone wrong really, or you've got the inkling of it, but it hasn't in her eyes. So he's still very much her Prince Charming and her protector. So we were able to kind of carve a bubble for them within that moment. The paparazzi all go sort of underwatery and reverby, and the rain kind of drifts away as well. And we carve them this sort of intimate space there for their conversation, which absolutely shows what Charles could have been, her protector, her savior from the paparazzi, rather than the kind of startled deer in headlights that she is when she's confronted on the street on her own by them and the like.
It's really interesting. I think what you did, going into that, I think, that sort of very first scene, going back to the one in the car, I think, she's full of smiles and she's full of joy. She's just about to embark on this extraordinary, this change in her life, this sort of, this fairy tale. And that moment when the guy, that closes the door and there's this sort of vacuum around her, this sort of protective vacuum, and the paparazzi all of a sudden are outside and she's in it full of smiles, and that, again, it's that sort of, those little moments that are sort of, what, spin into so many other moments where, and bit by piece, they're chipped away, and there is that vacuum, like, I guess Lee goes, right? It sort of disappears. That first fairy tale, that stepping into it, she's sort of smiles, and it's sort of in that, and that's the bit we altered and went back to, I was talking about earlier, and that sort of, I think that's where that's its nucleus, and from there onwards, the paparazzi, and as we all know, become more and more. So
yeah, challenge for the next season.
So this episode is really, one of the main things that you're accomplishing narratively with this episode is this arc of Diana and her journey from it starting off being this fairy tale, and she's she's going to become a princess, and then little by little, Lee, I like how you brought up that sequence in the rain when Charles just proposes and then leaves for several months. Things just slowly start to get more and more sour for Diana as she comes to realize that Buckingham Palace in this life is going to be kind of a gilded cage for her. One of the sequences that I find really remarkable, and especially because it's no dialogue, is the sequence when Diana is kind of just dancing ballet by herself in Buckingham Palace. Jan, can you tell us a little bit about kind of how you approached this sequence and how you built it and shaped it? Because it starts in such a carefree exuberance, but then it goes in a very different direction.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I pretty much cut that once. That was it. I think I made 2 small changes to it, and it never changed again. It sort of and it was the evolution of it was sort of changed musically and with sound. But where she was prior to that scene, the revelation, the realization of Camilla's being in contact with her with Charles, and she hasn't heard from him at all, so I sort of made the scene, her pushing back. It was sort of her. There's something that makes her happy with dancing, and ballet, and that's how the sort of scene starts. And it was, shot beautifully by Adriano, but the sort of it just naturally evolved into what it became. And on the day, when Ben filmed it, the actress she sort of danced sort of this bits of ballet, but she also did this sort of bit of contemporary dancing. And then at the end, Ben in the last take, he just sort of went, just go nuts. And she just went nuts and sort of just went this crazy stuff. And as soon as I sort of pieced it together, I just like, well, it can't just be the ballet. She has to the penny has to drop, and she has to sort of go, I've just found out that, this has happened. And the sort of dance turns into that. And I kind of wanted to sort of, and this is, I really like this, in sort of editing decisions when you make them. And so I also wanted to sort of see that even though she was sort of in this exuberant happiness, to sort of transition to this loneliness and sort of longingness of her, that she does love him and she wants to be with him. So in the middle of that sequence, there's that twirl. I just cut to her sat on the floor in the middle of the room, right in the middle of it, with all the music, and she just looks to the door, and she's a sort of small, princess alone, whining, pining for this, this prince to come back. And then it comes back to the dancing, and then it goes into the chaos. And it was all rehearsed with a share track, and then I cut the scene with a bit of score from Martin Phipps, and then it sort of evolved into Elton John. I mean, who would know? It was like a sort of piece of alchemy, and it just all came together at that point. And I remember sort of going, okay, I can't stay with Elton. And so I transitioned to Martin Phipps's cue and sort of in that chaotic bit. And the sort of 2 things really went well together. It was like sort of amazing. It echoed through. And there's so much buried storytelling in that, from Elton, and B, from this sort of, this young girl. It's so layered. It's extraordinary. It sort of leaps into history, as you're watching the scene, she was such an important character. So to have a scene like that, where again, like you're saying, with no words and just this visual thing, but yet it's telling you so much about what you already know, and this character, this sort of type of woman that she was,
Yeah. And obviously this episode is it's full of pathos, because of course we all know how the story ends, right? And even exactly. as I was watching that sequence, and I realized, oh, this is an Elton John song. And then of course I think, oh, the relationship between Diana and Elton John and his version of Candle in the Wind that he did, like it's so rich. Yeah. And even people who may not know that history, it takes on that kind of weight. It's really it's beautiful storytelling. It
really does. And it's not, like I say, this is not like a binary thing. It's not like, oh yeah, let's do this scene, let's put Elton John in it. The evolution of that goes from, a girl an actress who doesn't really dance ballet, and sort of, who isn't, this space, the cinematography, to Ben's ideas, to a pop song, to a crazy bit, to a piece of score, to Elton. It evolved over time, but when it gets to that final piece, it's like, well, that's what it should be. That's exactly what it should be. And I don't know, if you asked me, on something else and said, how are you going to do that? I wouldn't be able to answer that. That's the part of the journey that we all sort of embark on, and hats off to Peter Morgan for allowing us, the creativity to do that, that it isn't one thing, that isn't on and off, and going and touching on what you're saying about we do know this. We know this. This history of this beautiful woman and the importance of her and what happened to her and tragic all it is I was very mindful of that in the scene, always to stay and lean into this innocent, happy young woman, always, and always tread that very carefully, because it's unusual to watch a film when you know the ending, isn't it? That's a very unusual sort of storytelling, so I always remain that all the time to what would this young girl be going through in these experiences, and I imagine any girl around the world, when she's sort of happy or sad, dances around the bedroom, to a piece of music, it's relatable, isn't it? It's hugely relatable, so she just happens to be in this huge, great big room, or happens to be roller skating around this huge, great big palace. But I think we all do the same thing, when we're in these happinesses and these lows of our lives, so it's kind of that,
One of the things that really struck me watching the show, and this episode in particular, is subtext and the difference between what is being said and what is not being said. I think you Brits do subtext very, very well. And there are a couple of great sequences in this show, Jan, that I wanted to ask you about. I'm thinking first of all about just that extraordinary lunch scene when Diana meets Camilla for lunch, and she starts off, and Diana's very powerful at the very beginning of that sequence. She's very assured, she's very confident, and we kind of see her crumble a bit. And I was struck even by the way this scene was blocked and shot. They're not sitting opposite a table from each other. So they're sitting on the same, almost on the same side of a table, almost kind of looking at each other in profile. It's sort of like a French angle. They're sometimes shot from behind. Can you talk a little bit about putting that sequence together and narratively what you needed to accomplish?
I mean, Ben said, it's really interesting. Ben said to me, he rehearsed the scene, and interestingly, when he rehearsed it, he rehearsed it with, with Charles in the room, at the table, and had the three of them, sort of the love triangle, and put the three of them in the room, and then sort of asked the actresses to sort of remember that. And then when they came to shoot the film, the rehearsal was sometime before, but when they came to that scene, he kind of reminded them that Charles is in the room. Charles is the food. Just think of him as the food between the two of them. That food is your weapon, and, historically we know that Diana had these, this sort of, issues with bulimia and stuff, so it was a sort of magnifying of that. And when Ben rang me, sort of filmed it, he said, "When you're going to love this scene," he goes, "I've shot it so simply," which is sort of, it doesn't need to be complicated. It was shot with them very simply, and that's how I kind of cut it. I cut it very simply, and then, but at the same time, he picked up all the stuff on the plates, as he does, this sort of detail of the meringue and the food and everything else. So as the sort of Camilla sort of loads upon loads, these sort of poisonous darts that sort of fire into her, that she spent all this time pushing around the food, and sort of Camilla, eats and talks at the same time, and it was that kind of detail that, again, is sort of representing, it's the sort of, I know something you don't, and it just sort of expands and expands and expands until the point where her only defense is to sort of eat this sugary, high calorie sort of food, and in Peter's brilliant writing, this is a place where you sort of have a starter and a dessert, there's no main course, it's all sort of layered in there.
It was a really complex sequence to mix as well, wasn't it, Jan? I'm trying to get my head back there, but that whole sequence where you were talking about the poison darts, but where Camilla's really laying it onto her, and as Diana starts to go into the play, I remember we did one version where we really drifted off Camilla's words, and so she went off into into a reverby space, and we really tried to get into Diana's head. We tried a version where kind of a bit of score came in as well. I just remember just going round and round in circles on that sequence of trying to find the most effective way to land it and not impose.
There was an idea that I sort of carried over for some time, and it was really nice because sort of by the end of it, when every sort of other people in post and executives watched it, never really sort of taking it away, but I think again Lee and Nikki Moosley, who's the post-production producer, we had that sort of, again, that sort of that email at the end of the day going, should we just put it all back, like sort of straight, like how, you know, sort of like it sort of go. That was a great example of that. I sort of had something in the cutting room that turned into something else, became something else, but went back to being two women talking in a room.
I'm struck by something that you're both saying, and you brought it up a couple of times, both in the construction of the ballet sequence and then your experimentation and trying different approaches to this particular sequence at the lunch. It really seems like the producers gave you the time to experiment, try different approaches, and find it. And that's such a gift.
Well, we're not ruled by the schedule on this show. There is a schedule, and there's a post-producer who desperately wants to keep to the schedule. But ultimately, it's got to be right. So if you get to the end of the final mix and something's not working in the episode, Peter's really happy to open up the episode, make a change to the cut if that's what's needed. If we need more time in the mix, we spend more time in the mix. If we need a new cue, it happens. You know, we don't just say that's it. It's the last day of mixing. It's going out. You know, with people not being quite happy with it.
Yeah, I think having that sort of central creative mind in the middle of it, all of it at the center is pretty useful. You know,
one of the sequences I really love is the montage sequence of the royal family getting ready on the wedding day.
Lots of people here went to the fireworks display last night in Hyde Park and then came straight down to the palace afterwards to make sure they get a good spot.
We're now getting closer to that point when Prince Charles and then Lady Diana will set off for St. Paul's. A scene that will be quite literally flashed around the globe.
King, Queen of the Belgians, King of Norway, with the Crown Prince and the Crown Princess, Queen of Denmark and the Prince of Denmark, King and Queen of Sweden, the Queen of the Netherlands, the Prince of the Netherlands, Grand Duke and Grand Duchess of Luxembourg, Prince and Princess of Liechtenstein, and the Princess of Monaco. The next time we see that coach, we'll be peering inside these windows to see if we can get some idea of what the wedding dress really looks like.
Thank you.
Here is the stuff of which fairy tales are made. The prince and princess on their wedding day. But fairy tales usually end at this point with the simple phrase, they lived happily ever after. This may be because fairy tales regard marriage as an anticlimax after the romance of courtship. As husband and wife live out their vows, loving and cherishing one another, sharing life's splendors and miseries, achievements and setbacks, they will be transformed in the process.
One of the reasons I love it is because it's such a juxtaposition of scale. You know, the television is giving us kind of the reaction of the world. And yet what you're giving to us is this real intimacy of people being dressed. And it almost in a way, like you could say, well, sure, it's much cheaper to shoot to shoot people getting dressed than to stage a wedding. But at the same time, narratively, that also gives us something really, it really reinforced to me like how lonely these people are.
Yeah, I think that the sort of final montage was sort of it. You know, it's obviously the decision was we were never going to go to the wedding. You know, I mean, to stage that wedding would have been extraordinarily expensive and something that, you know, you could go and watch on YouTube and, you know, millions and millions of people have seen, you know. So knowing that at some point, I'm sure lots of people, when it sort of got to the end, some people, you know, they sort of see the dress go away. And in my mind, it was sort of the way it was framed, that Charles was sort of, it was like he was looking at her, you know, sort of leaving this sort of big train, you know, and there he is making his decision. And in that sort of journey, I scoured over tons of archive of the wedding. In fact, I watched so many hours of it, and I sort of knew the wedding inside out, you know, and sort of looking for bits of archive to go into the televisions, and kind of got sort of seduced by it. You know, I watched it, the pre stuff and the build up, you know, because it's the sort of time I sort of remember as a young person, you know. So I saw it all in a very different way, you know, how you would have seen it back then. So, and I sort of went through all this stuff, and then I stumbled across Host of sort of Wedding Vows. There was this read from the Archbishop, you know, this sort of voice where he started to talk about fairy tales, and my sort of jaw dropped. I mean, his voice is extraordinary. And I just sort of thought, and I was going to put something in the end roller. I was going to sort of go, shall I just put a little bit of the wedding? It was going to be this like top shot, St. Paul's Cathedral, with this BBC camera looking through the sort of circle at the top with these two little characters and all these thousands of people in these altar chairs. And I kind of made it, never showed it to Peter or anyone, sort of scrapped it. But I found this voiceover and I thought, you know what, why not? So I sort of pieced it together and put it in, and it just, in my head, it sort of, for me, having watched all the archive, it sort of, it leapfrogged you into the wedding that you were not going to see. And yet the words were so right for what the pictures and the story you were telling me. Who would have thought? You know, those sort of words that were coming out were sort of saying all about these sort of what marriage means and what two people mean to one another. And this huge Greek tragedy of what this two characters are about to unfold, as again, like we were saying earlier, what you already know about this story. But in my mind, I wanted to allow some people to go, okay, you didn't show us the wedding, but you've got the VO from the Archbishop, and isn't that good? You know, this voiceover sort of somehow takes you there, but doesn't take you there. And that was kind of my feeling with it. And I played it to Peter, and he was just like, leave it. Perfect. Don't change it. That's it. You know.
So Lee, did you replace the Archbishop recording, or is that actually the original?
No, it's the original sound, but quite late in the dub, we're trying to work out how to give it more scale. It was quite a thin recording, so we ended up creating a stereo by feeding it into Pentio to suddenly give it a width that the other dialogue didn't have. So you know, that and some EQ and all the rest of it to give it a richness, let's say. But yeah, so it's rescuing some pretty damaged archive.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I didn't even realize that we didn't see the wedding. I didn't miss it. You know, you get that sense of scale from it. Jan, you brought up this sequence with the scene with the Queen and Charles the night before the wedding when she gives him the duty speech, and I do want to touch on that because it's a really extraordinary scene, and there's a lot going on there. I have a feeling like, you know, many years from now, when Olivia Colman is starting to receive her Lifetime Achievement Awards, this is one of the scenes that they're going to play. I think it's going to become iconic.
Mummy?
When your great-grandmother, Queen Mary, was a beautiful young princess, she was about to marry her Prince Charming. But before they got to the church, he fell ill and died. But everyone had been so impressed with her that they put her together with his younger brother. Only one problem: the younger brother was Prince Charmless. Dull and shy. There was no attraction, certainly no love. But in order to make the marriage work, they were encouraged to focus on the bigger idea: duty. They worked and worked and worked. And out of that work, a tiny seed grew. A seed of respect and admiration. A seed that grew into a flower they could eventually call love. They were married for 42 years. They stabilized a country that was at war with itself. And they left the crown stronger, while all around them the great monarchies of Europe fell.
You know, what a gift to both of you, the way it was blocked and shot with the fireworks. And I'm just going to let you guys tell me a little bit about how this sequence was put together. Just even the extraordinary fact that, you know, they're both standing looking out windows and talking kind of past each other, you know,
Yeah, it's a. I mean, all credit to Adriana and Ben. The sort of that making those decisions on the. He rang me again. That's that thing. He does that call going. I may have made things difficult for you because I've got practical lights outside for fireworks. So they're going to be changing colours. And then on top of that, he goes, I'm not really going to have them look at each other. That's. I was like, okay, And then when in the original script, when she first arrived, the first line she says when she entered the room was, "Have you got rid of the other one?" And I cut that line immediately. But then that line, I just thought, well, how am I going to convey that whole piece of dialogue and that on that one line? Have you got rid of the other one? That's basically it. So I took that line out, and then the scene sort of played. And I do remember having a feeling when I was sort of behind, Olivia Colman, when she's sort of delivering the bit, which is extraordinary to sort of deliver that line where about, that you sort of basically learn to love somebody, right? It's sort of this powerful word, love. And I sort of stayed behind her. It was sort of like, and that sort of, it is, like you say, it's interesting framing. She's sort of looking, you're sort of over the sort of behind on the profile, but Charles is over here too, sort of defocused. And I just remember thinking, this sort of just feels right. It just feels really, really right this way, to sort of sit here. And I sort of had goosebumps. And it's one of those moments where I remember this in sort of season 1, in certain scenes that sort of Peter writes and sort of, other directors and other editors have made, where there's a sort of certain feeling where it just harks back to the core of The Crown. You have these little scenes every now and then you go, that's a Crown scene. It sort of goes back to this. It's not just us. We're little people too. The Crown is bigger than us. It's this huge thing. And when she does that monologue, I just sort of sat there and just went, this has got to be played as simple as possible. And Charles doesn't say a word. And I just stuck with those same two angles. I did have some problems with the lighting and had to split screen some shots just to get the pinks and the blues to match. And I was quite delicate with the fireworks. I was quite intimidated by the sort of noise of the fireworks. And then it came to sort of Lee, and Lee sort of went, right, okay, the fireworks are going to become part of this thing. And it was just extraordinary. I just sat there, I just went, how does this work? It has this little bit of music that we use in there that sort of harks back to Duck Shoot, which is sort of a little echo of that Martin that sort of recreated one of the original cues. And for me, that for me is a defining Crown piece of dialogue. It's when Peter writes that, where other European monarchies have failed, this is like a bigger picture. It makes me shudder that these people, this family, this sort of, this huge sort of, lineage goes back so far and so important. The smallest things that tie it together,
Dialogue-wise, in the scene we play with the space. So at the front of it, we're really exaggerating the scale, the size of the room on the voices, so you convey sonically that the distance between the two of them, that the shots are also revealing. So you'll very much hear a change in quality on Olivia's voice as you're with Charles and she's speaking at one end of the room, and you cut over to her and it goes close and intimate again and she's talking into your ear. And then the fireworks, as you say, I absolutely tried to score the sequence, building to a final sort of barrage at the end as she really lets rip, and you get the kind of the finale moment of the ripping, cracking sort of skyline. And then there's a couple of beats along the way. So Jan's talking about, Olivia mentions the word love twice, and both of those moments, the fireworks disperse off into reverb and all becomes a little bit romanticized, and then back in crackly again as she starts to snipe away at him.
Yeah, it's really impressive how they did it. I didn't think it would work, and it did. And it's sort of interesting, when he made more of the fireworks thing, narratively, and how all these things sort of come to fruition is, when I went into the montage scene next, the day of the wedding, and I found all the archive, and I found the real guy talking about the morning of the wedding, the weather, and he goes, and some people were in Hyde Park last night, went to the fireworks, so these right. The two things you see, it goes together. They're for me, that's the storytelling is. Yeah, they went to the fireworks in Hyde Park, but they didn't see what went on in that room that night. The
real fireworks that were happening inside
the real fireworks. Yeah. And that's So by Lee sort of making the narrative of these fireworks and not being, less being shy and go, do you know what, should we just put the fireworks like they're really far away and we don't hear them, magnifies the storytelling. That's how it all sort of, comes together, which is not always planned. It just evolves. It's kind of, that's the beauty of it, isn't it?
The other ingredient that's running through all of that is, of course, the crowd that are actually over in the park. So you've got the kind of, through the window, the hubbub of them out there constantly, and then they scream and react to specific moments within the fireworks, which again just adds a kind of a tension and an emotion to the moments, I suppose.
It puts even more pressure on them because you don't really think about the royal family in the palace, in Buckingham Palace, being able to hear the crowd outside, but of course they can, right?
We've always talked about them being goldfish in a bowl, which is essentially what they are.
Yeah, it does. It's the pressure, isn't it? The fireworks become, it's that thing, isn't it? It's down as sort of streaming this monologue to him, and it's like it's the people outside, expecting the wedding. It's like the fireworks are crackling away. There's no way out. You're not backing out of this now. That they go together. That's the sort of remarkable thing about this sort of, this storytelling. Yes, we're dramatizing it. Yes, all of that. But, it's what happens behind. I imagine many, many, many people when they've got married, aren't they, the night before, they're sort of in that sort of, kind of, and the outside is the sort of all the people supping the champagne. They're like, shall I tell them now or shall I tell them tomorrow? But this is the stakes are slightly higher. But it's that, I think that, and that's kind of the fireworks, by the bravery of Adriana lighting it that way, by the framing of that, by Lee going, I'm not going to hold back. I'm going to tell this story. They're over there celebrating. It all comes together.
Well, it's truly an amazing sequence. I know that you were just barely starting to work on this episode when COVID lockdown happened. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how you pivoted and how you finished the episode? And Lee, how did mix reviews work? Tell us a little bit about that.
Redesigning post-production for us, really. We were sort of 4 weeks into the show, just started sound editorial when lockdown happened over here. So we were pretty quick onto it. One of the first things we had to do was create a Mobile Adr Kit. You talk about these things now and they've become like normal terms and remote this, remote that, but just none of it was there at that point. So we were aware that we had a number of more elderly actors on our cast and that people wouldn't be wanting to come into town even if we could put them into an individual studio with a recordist in another room. People just didn't want to leave their houses. We were in lockdown in the UK. So one of the first things that happened was Gibran, the ADR recordist at Boom, myself, we talked through various options and came up with a kind of kit that contained an iPad, a clip mic, a shotgun mic, that could be sent to the actors with a simple sort of video of how to set it up in their own room, and then Gibran was running the sessions from Boom, using Zoom to put out the picture at that point in those early days, and was it clean feed to record discrete feeds back into the Pro Tools. So that was kind of challenge number one. Spotting sessions were happening using I think was it Frankie, the software we're using, Jan. With the cutting room sharing it with us. Sound editorial, that was kind of fine that people, I'm sat in my room at home at the moment. So, most people are set up to work at home now. That's not such a big deal. But then from remote ADR, we went into remote crowd. That was like, a new kind of like mind boggling moment. But it turned out a lot of the loop artists actually had, it's George
That
Rock.
sounds terrifying.
But yeah, a lot of the crowd artists have actually got setups at home. So tests happened beforehand to ensure that we had levels that worked and settings that worked for them. And again, using clean feed to get it into Pro Tools, it meant you ended up with like a crowd track that could be sort of 20 layers deep at any given point, because everything's on a separate microphone. So everything took a long time in terms of cutting it and then mixing it, because you have to explore so many faders. But it gave you a beautiful level of control, which I'll find it very hard to go back to, here's a stereo track with 10 people talking, or whatever you might get. It's really nice being able to kind of pick and choose what aspects you really wanted to feature at any given moment. And then on and on it went. So then we were mixing, and we still weren't out of this palaver. So
there are lots of positives. I think sort of positive change came. I think everyone has a sort of positive change with COVID. I mean, picture-wise, we were just 2 weeks out from end of filming, so they lost 2 weeks of shooting, didn't they? They and one of the Avalanche.
Two days they were short. Yeah.
Oh, 2 days they were short. So we were kind of in that respect. But what is, what I think what's come from the sort of what Lee having to adapt. I think picture-wise, I worked from home a fair bit before, so it wasn't so hard for me. But my assistants and other assistants had to sort of also move these editing equipment into their homes, into their living rooms, and so so it was that was difficult, for the technology to connect us caught up, and the process sort of then found its water, with the notes process and everything else, and then the technology sort of evolved, and all of a sudden the next thing we're color grading on these screens, and as Lee's saying, I sort of mixed with those guys on camera in a room, and they were in the background, and I sort of sat at home with these sort of nice headphones on. I was like, this is pretty good, and I sort of, Lee would press every time I gave a silly note, he'd sort of mute me or something, I'd be sort of like this, and then the sort of that sort of evolved, I think, from VFX to everybody to this process is sort of caught up, and then the reality came sort of after that, which is, with this COVID thing is, there wasn't any people out there filming the next shows, and that's when the cliff edge come. And it just makes me think we can do all this remotely with all this technology, but unless a load of really tough people get together and turn those cameras on and run around dressed as different people to go shoot, the rest of this and us are irrelevant. It's that I had a big gap. I'm sure you did too, Lee. We were lucky on that time to sort of finish the post on The Crown, but there was that gap when things didn't happen. And I think, that is a reminder to us all that with all this technology, that putting some people together in a field with a camera and some sound microphones is the only way we make stuff. That is it.
For the actual mixes, Glenn, that still happened at Boom, my studio in Soho. So we just did separation within the building. So myself and Stuart Hilliker, the dialogue and music mixer on the episode, were alone in the main mixing room. Then we put the director on the floor below in a smaller sort of Dolby certified pre-mixing room. So they were having their room was chasing our room. So they were hearing exactly what we were hearing through a different space. And then the editors were linking in from home on headphones. What we're using for that, Clearview, to share a stereo feed of what was coming out of the console. So that's how the whole mix was conducted. And then for the mix review, everyone then came on site. Myself and Stu didn't go in for the mix review. We'd go into a separate room because we had to keep working. Basically, we're straight on to the next episode, sort of thing. So we just couldn't catch anything. But so the producers and the like all gathered in one room to watch it, and then they had an hour to kind of give us notes, and then everyone would disperse again, and we're back into our little bubble upstairs.
Amazing. Well, I think you just partially answered this question, but Lee, so you're the supervising sound editor, but you also mix the show. So you're supervising the editorial crew, and then once the mix happens, did you just say that? So you're mixing effects, and then you work with another mixer on dialogue and music?
Correct. Yeah. Stuart Hilliker mixed the dialogue and music on this one.
How does it affect? It's an interesting. I like that combination. The supervising sound editor who also mixes. But can you talk a little bit about wearing those two hats, and is that a more efficient way for you because you're prepping your tracks thinking as a mixer and mixing thinking as an editor, and vice versa, right?
I think so. I absolutely love to mix my own stuff. Even the pre-mix is like the final stage of editorial for me, where I'm pulling it all together and making my last decisions and making those choices. But yeah, I know the material inside out. So it's sort of rather than playing Chinese whispers in many ways. People ask you for something, you know where it is, you're on top of the material. And if you want something to be different, it's your job, So I've got my sound miner running and I change and tweak and it's sort of, yeah.
I always assumed that was completely normal. And then I did a mix on a different show and Lee wasn't there. I was like, where's Lee? They're like, oh, yeah, he's doing something else. I just thought it was completely normal. He was always there. It just felt like him and Stuart are sort of so cohesively, umbilically connected in a brilliant way. You only notice that Lee's gone. He's on another show. So
I've been mixing with Stu for the best part of 20 years. And I guess after sort of 13, 14 years of sitting in a room together, I got a bit bored of the sound of my own voice, asking for things and suggesting things. I thought, you know what, just do it yourself. So at that point, we moved the effects faders over to my side of the console, and off I went.
Well, my final question for both of you is: it's a really amazing experience watching the show, and of course, as an American, I have a very different perspective on it than you two. But it really, one of the things that I love about The Crown is that it does humanize the royal family. So I'm curious to ask both of you, working on this show, has this changed how you feel about the royal family and about how you feel about the institution of the monarchy now that you have a greater sense of these people as human beings?
That's a very interesting question, isn't it? I'm not sure if we're allowed to answer that. I mean, it's really interesting.
For me, it's a yes. Greater empathy, of course. It's like, and it's been a real history lesson for me anyway, working on the show. It's kind of my jaw just hits the floor as Peter finds some other unimaginable detail. It's like, seriously, that happened as well? It's like you just couldn't write a lot of what's happened to them. So, the Queen, wow, what a lady.
Yeah, no, it is extraordinary. And my experience of that is actually the other way. Is I admire them. I do admire them. I do admire the Queen hugely. So before I even made The Crown, I actually met the Queen Mother at St. Paul's when I was at Cub Scouts. So I guess it's in our lives. But what I do experience though is people, friends and like sort of mums and dads at my kids' school, when you sort of meet them and they sort of go, "Oh, you're working on The Crown," that you have this reaction. I've had this before, where people react to sort of go, "I'm preposterous," or "Why would I want to watch a show about the Queen?" And you sort of cut to about 2 months later, they come up to you and go, "By the way, The Crown is amazing." And they sort of have that, the thing that Peter Morgan is so clever at, he puts the sort of sugar in, but he puts the pepper and the salt in at the same time, and that's what people experience. They sort of come back and go, that they learn something and they experience something, and it sort of becomes about this sort of this family that's just sort of, larger than life. It's extraordinary. So I have that quite a few times. Why on earth would I want to watch that? People in frocks and clothes and stuff like that, and they come back and it's sort of like the experience is more like watching The Sopranos or something. It really
well said.
It is. It's sort of, yeah.
Well said. Well, Jan and Lee, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about this Fairytale episode. It's really just amazing work. Congratulations to the both of you on your Emmy nominations, and good luck at the proceedings in a couple of months.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Real
It's been
pleasure.
a joy to talk.
Many thanks again to Jan Miles and Lee Walpole for taking the time to speak with us, and congratulations on their incredibly well-deserved Emmy nominations. I also would like to thank our friends at Netflix, who put this conversation together for us and provided us very generously with those amazing clips to look at and discuss. If you haven't watched this season of The Crown, I really encourage you to do so because you are missing out. You can find it on Netflix, and as always, via the links in our show notes. And if you haven't already, please make sure you are subscribed to us, the Dolby Institute podcast. We will have more coverage on some of the Emmy nominees coming up in the next few weeks that you will not want to miss. You can find links to our dedicated podcast feed in the show notes or by searching for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, please consider leaving us a rating or a review on the Apple Podcasts app. It really helps us raise awareness for the show and continue to grow our audience. Until then, thank you for joining us. This has been the Sound and Image Lab, the Dolby Institute podcast, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with production support by Taylor Hines. Thank you for listening.